Today we will have only one speaker. It will be Grzegorz Piątek, a famous architectural critic and a co-founder of Centrum Architektury Foundation. And today he will be talking about how European tourists and architecture tourists, yes, perceived New York City in the 1930s. Without further ado, please welcome Grzegorz Piątek.
Thank you, Maciej. Thank you for having me here today. And I'm just wondering about the microphone. It doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
All right. So today I will try to give you an overview of architects, of famous architects, famous European modern architects who visited American cities, mainly New York, in the first decades of the 20th century, and the impact that the American architecture and the American urban situation made on European architecture and on global modern architecture. Up to the late 19th century, the exchange between the two continents, the old continent and America, was pretty slow, and the reason was obviously the slowness of travel between the two continents, and that changed in about 1870, when various technical advances made the crossing between England and America much faster, much safer, and much more economically feasible than before, and that sped up the exchange of people and ideas between the old and the new continent. Before, America was a rather exotic place, and thanks to these new ways of travel, the new ocean liners, this one, the Oceanic, is considered the first modern ocean liner to cross the Atlantic to America. The journey would take around 8 days, and that was fast by the standards of that era, and that brought many people from Europe who would come to visit, not just to not to migrate, but to visit America and go back to Europe and with their impressions. The first major modern architect to venture to America was Adolf Loos. Adolf Loos was born in what is now called Brno in the Czech Republic, then Brünn, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a stonemason's son, interested in architecture, sculpture, and art from his early years. He graduated from the Technical University in Dresden, and then he decided at the age of 23 to travel to America and to look for new experiences, new ideas. He was pretty frustrated with the situation in Europe. Europe made him feel a bit claustrophobic, and he thought that America will give him a new perspective on various things, including architecture. So that was his first major journey after he completed his studies, his training in Dresden. Loos's uncle was a clockmaker in Philadelphia, and young Adolf stayed with him in the beginning, but then he set off to New York, and he made a living. He made a very he was trying to make a living, and take various jobs. He worked as a music critic, for instance, even though he had no clue about music, for one German language newspaper in New York, and but he was a brilliant writer. So when he wrote his first review, it was so bad in a way, but so well written, that other critics thought that it's a spoof, that it's a satire on musical musical criticism, and he became famous for this music review that was completely amateur but brilliantly and finally wittily written. When Adolf Loos arrived in America, American architects and American architecture critics were very harsh about the state of architecture in the United States. One of the biggest architectural writers of that era in America, a man called Bar Ferre, noted in 1893 that, quote, "Current American architecture is not a matter of art, but of business. A building must pay, or there will be no investor ready with the money to meet its cost." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This is at once the curse and the glory of American architecture. So this is the sort of architecture Adolf Loos got to know in the United States. He visited New York and he visited also Chicago for the Columbian exposition that Maciej mentioned in his presentation 2 weeks ago. The Columbian exposition in Chicago in 1893 was, as Maciej said 2 weeks ago, was considered a major breakthrough in American architecture, in the City Beautiful movement, a rather conservative movement when it comes to form, where buildings allude to various forms of historic architecture. But at the same time, Loos was not so much impressed with the architecture of the exhibition pavilions, but much more with the exhibits and the brilliant technical advances that were exhibited at this exhibition. Here's a quote from one account of Robert Schoy, who was Loos's friend, who wrote a few years later. Enlightenment came to him in America, to Adolf Loos. He remembers how, his head still full of the notions of ideal beauty that he had learned in art school in Europe, he would wander through exhibitions in America of the latest technology, and he would think that this is still a young land. This is a land where they use technology resolutely. This is a land where they chop down trees in ancient forests and run railroads over them. Here they build steel bridges over chasms and waterfalls. Here they string telegraph wires across prairies. And it's beautiful. It's lightning bolt beauty, a rushing together of high technology and the wild earth. So that's a spirit that's very. This is the thought that keeps coming back in the Europeans' accounts of American architecture, the American urban culture. That this is a land of opportunity, a land of great technology that is being used very boldly and very on a grand scale, and where this wild, let's say, wild earth is covered with this new civilizations that seems to know no limits, no fears. In New York City, he spotted a suitcase. He was fascinated. Suddenly he had it. The suitcase is modern. That's what the modern is all about. And at that moment, all those false and phony ideas he had learned about art and beauty, they tumbled away. Now he knew his way. The functional is the beautiful. And these are some of the great technical advances that he could have seen at the Columbian exposition in Chicago. In the picture on the upper part of the slide, you can see the first moving sidewalk in the world. I think it's now called a travelator in airports. So a sidewalk that moves, that was laid out along the pier on Lake Michigan, where people could just actually take trips up and down the pier on a moving sidewalk, and one of the new American steam engines, locomotives that helped to bring people across the continent. So Adolf Loos was not that much impressed by the actual architecture of America. He was impressed with the so-called Chicago School, the commercial style. And but he was very much impressed with technical advances and with the design, with the practical, functional design of the everyday objects. with the practicality of the American people. And that trip to America was one of the biggest inspirations in his work as an architect and an architectural critic. Later, a few years later, he built a house on the St. Michael's Square in Vienna, the Michaelplatz, that you can see on this slide. That was one of the first buildings in Europe to match the architecture of the Chicago school or the Chicago commercial style, with its bare facades that had almost no decoration, and a very practical, a very functional design. This building actually scandalized the public in Vienna with its bare facades, including the emperor Franz Joseph himself, whose windows, the wing of the palace in Hofburg in Vienna was actually across the street from this house. And the story has it that that from the moment that this house went up across the street from his window, he had the curtains drawn permanently because he just couldn't stand looking at it. It seemed so minimal and so unrefined to his eyes. Later on, Adolf Loos went on to preach his ideas in his famous writings, such as Ornament and Crime, one of the most famous architecture manifestos of the 20th century. You can see a poster on the right-hand side of one of the talks, one of the lectures, where he read his paper, his manifesto, Ornament und Verbrechen, Ornament and Crime, in which he also advocated all these things that he learned in America: the practicality, the functionality, the lack of ornamentation that he admired about the everyday objects and the machines in America. Europeans like Adolf Loos in the late 19th and early 20th century were obviously inspired by the scale and the audacity of what was going on in America in terms of engineering. And they were trying to reinvent the American building types, including the skyscraper, and give it a more refined form, because what American architects would do, they would use these most advanced building techniques, like the steel frame, and go up and build the tallest buildings in the world, but still use the historical decorations for the facade. So they were in a way concealing the modern aspect of the buildings they were designing. And many European architects considered that a mistake, and they kept making their own proposals for a truly modern skyscraper. The most famous of them was probably the skyscraper in Friedrichstraße in Berlin, proposed by Mies van der Rohe in 1921. It was never built because it was impossible to build. But what he did was propose a steel frame tower with a curtain wall, with a facade that's that's made out of glass and completely transparent, that would not conceal the truth behind this architecture, the steel frame that made this building, that made it possible to build that high. It was not possible with traditional masonry techniques. So the steel frame would be exposed through this transparent curtain wall. And at the same time in America, if you look at the skyscrapers built at precisely the same moment in history, they were still following these principles that were thought so wrong and so dishonest in America, in Europe. So American architects kept repeating the same formula, building a very modern structure and concealing it behind a facade that alludes to some historical style that they learned in Beaux-Arts in the Beaux-Arts school, studying the examples of the great buildings, historic buildings in Europe, like the palazzos of Florence or the Gothic cathedrals of various European cities. So this is the standard oil building in New York City, designed at the same time, 1921, precisely the same year when Mies van der Rohe made his bold proposal for Berlin. So America did not seem interested in this sort of sophistication. Adolf Loos also tried his luck in America. He submitted a proposal for a very prestigious and very well paid competition in 1922 for the headquarters of the Chicago Tribune, one of the biggest news organizations in America back then. And this news organization was planning to build a new tower for itself in downtown Chicago, and they called an international competition. Adolf Loos submitted a building that is considered by some a parody of American architecture, a statement, more an ironic statement than a serious proposal for a building. He proposed building a column, a Doric column-shaped building that would be a hollow column that would be divided into floors and pierced with windows. And he called it the most beautiful and distinctive office building in the world. So you can, in a way, sense the irony of his in it. And this is the proposal that actually won the competition by an American studio, Raymond Hood and John Mead Howells, one of the biggest practices in America back then, specialists in skyscrapers, who proposed a Gothic revival tower. And it was actually built, and it's still there to be admired in Chicago. The early 20s are the period when a very important book came out that I already mentioned 2 weeks ago, a book called Towards a New Architecture by Le Corbusier, the most prominent, Le Corbusier, who then became the most prominent architect and architecture writer of the 20th century. And in this book, Le Corbusier presented his proposals for renewing architecture, for breathing a new life into this sort of thing. You know, he was trying to propose a new direction for architecture, and trying to point out at the elements from architecture history that are the essence, could be seen as the essence of architecture, and also to point at the biggest and the most important technical advances and that should be included in these new ways of building. So on the opening spread, you can already see a skyscraper, a reference to America as the most one of the most innovative places when it comes to building at that time. And also in his book, Le Corbusier, well, he not just presented, he fetishized the engineering structures like not just the skyscraper, but also the grain silos, the steel bridges, the steamships, the cars, the automobile. So, and he presented this engineering, the works of engineers as the example to architects who, according to him, lost their way. But I will actually, when Le Corbusier was writing this in 1923, he was writing this not from first-hand experience, because he had never been to America by that point. And it took him another 12 years to get to America and to see actually see what he was advertising as the future of architecture. But if some modernist European architects actually ventured to America to start a practice. One of them, I think that the first important European architect who tried to have a career in America was Richard Neutra, an Austrian architect who gave up a very good position at an office of Erich Mendelssohn. I'll mention him later. Erich Mendelssohn, one of the most successful commercial modernist architects in Europe, or maybe the most successful one, who had a very big studio in Berlin. And Richard Neutra was one of the most important young architects at Mendelssohn's practice, but he decided nonetheless to live in America, and he went there in 1923, first to travel and to see the country, to see the cities, and he was fascinated. He was fascinated with the contrast of. He was at the same time disappointed, and amazed and disappointed. That's also a very. I will speak of the Corbusier later. He had the same feeling of being at the same time impressed with the scale of things and with the pace of life and with the audacity of the businessmen, the engineers. But at the same time, disappointed with the lack of culture, with the certain crassness of the American people, and with the So when Neutra left Europe in 1923, Europe was still scarred after the First World War. And in his eyes, America was a land without a scar, a land where everything is possible, that a land with no war trauma, with no war, with no political divides to deal with, a place where things could be, where new things could be developed, a brilliant laboratory. He wrote in one of his letters that it's a place where one continuously buys new socks and throws the old ones away. So also a very early account of the of the wild consumerist culture, where it makes more sense to keep buying new things than to repair them. And now we're 100 years wiser, and we know where it leads, but back in the early 20s, it seemed fascinating and refreshing to be in a place like this. He worked in some New York studios for a moment, then he left for Chicago, where he started to practice in architecture studios there. And Neutra considered Chicago as the center of new architecture, the most interesting place in the world, architecture-wise, where things were being done that are not possible anywhere else, and in Europe especially. So he worked for Daniel Burnham, one of the most prominent Chicago architects that I already that Maciek mentioned 2 weeks ago, and who was responsible for some of the most brilliant buildings in Chicago. And he was fascinated by the possibilities of prefabrication, of using ready-made elements to build buildings. That was something that was already dreamed of in Europe, but not done. It was not possible to manufacture building elements on the larger scales, but on a larger scale in Europe. But in America, it was already happening. So the architects were not fantasizing about things; they were just doing them, and that's what Neutra loved about America. This is his first major solo work in the States. It's considered the first steel frame house in America. I mean, an individual house, not a skyscraper or a warehouse. and one of the first international style buildings in the US. It's called the Lovell House. It was built for a doctor in California in the late 20s. And it embodies a lot of the ideals of the era, including the hygienic ideas of building a very healthy space. And with this house, he proved that it is possible to build what European architects would love to build in Europe, but they're not quite able to. He also wrote 2 books about building in America, right after, at pretty much the same time when he was working on the Lovell House. He published Wie baut Amerika in Stuttgart in 1927. The book, its first edition sold for 4,000 copies in Germany, so it was a huge success for an architecture book. And in this book, he presented the possibilities of mass prefabrication and his experience of working with the newest technologies in America. And this book was it didn't just sell very well, it was very well received by the critics in Germany. And it actually preceded a lot of European books where new ways of using prefabrication and in architecture were explored and given a more theoretical, a less practical background. Another important architecture tourist, another important architecture book from that era is Amerika, Bilderbuch eines Architekten, an architect's picture book written by Erich Mendelssohn. I already mentioned Mendelssohn as Richard Neutra's boss back in Berlin, who traveled to America in the mid-20s. He visited some of the cities on the eastern seaboard, Chicago, Detroit, so Northeast America basically. Actually, when we talk about these architects visiting America, it's mainly that portion of the country. Hardly anyone ventured further west. They were all interested in the big cities, the big industrial cities in the Northwest. And Mendelssohn was a man of, already in Europe, he was considered an American architect. He was not American, of course, he was a German Jew, born in, he was in today's Olsztyn, Einstein. In 1887, he was from a very wealthy Jewish bourgeois family. Actually, now you can see in Olsztyn his first building that was recently restored, and I really recommend you to visit it one day when you're in Olsztyn or in that part of the country. It's a funeral home at the Jewish cemetery, his earliest work. But then he left for Berlin and started a very successful practice there, and was the most successful, one of the most successful commercial architects in Germany and in Europe. But at the same time, he maintained a very good, he maintained a reputation for being a very sophisticated modern architect. So not commercial is not a derogatory term in this case. And he was very much inspired by the commercial architecture of Chicago. Here you can see on the left-hand side one of the department stores that he built for the German chain Schocken. He built at least 6 Schocken department stores in Germany, in Chemnitz, in Berlin, in Stuttgart, in Nuremberg. And on the right-hand side you can see the much earlier Carson Pirie Scott department store in Chicago on State Street, and you can see the resemblance. So Mendelssohn was very much interested in applying the same principles of open plan, open structure, and band windows, and applying them in commercial architecture. Later he actually he became an American. He in the 1930s, I believe, he immigrated to America, and he started practice in California. But before he settled in America for good, he made this trip across the Northeast, and he published this book, America. It's a picture book. He was a man of few words, so it's mainly consists of photographs and very brief descriptions. But this book was also quite successful, and it made a big impact on the imagination of European architects in the mid-20s. In this book, he covers these obvious, these things that Le Corbusier admired as well in his book from 1923, like the grain silos with this with their very purely practical architecture, like the skyscrapers. This is the Chicago Tribune Tower that I already mentioned. But he was very much impressed with the city life. And that's maybe understandable, because Berlin was also back then considered a very American city, a very chaotic, lively city, like the American ones. And he took this very poetic pictures of the street life, of the streets, of the street life. Here's my translation of the passage about Broadway. Broadway at night, unearthly, the silhouette of the buildings gone. But in the eye of the mind they grow bigger and bigger, chase and overtake one another. It's a screen for neon, the rocket fuel of moving advertising. So he was very much impressed by the neon and the possibilities of electric light, as the electric light. The electric light creating the scenery of the modern living. This is one of his works in Wrocław, the Petersdorf department store from the late 20s, in which he explored these possibilities of using electric light to enliven the facade of the building after at night. It's the building still exists. It's quite well renovated. It's quite well maintained. So I also recommend you to have a look at it when you're in Wrocław. And he also admired the Broadway by day. This is his description, his poetic description. No longer mysterious, fervent, dazzling. It is wild. It is out of hand. It outshouts itself. The grand follies of the world's marketplace. And this is here he lists things that are advertised in Broadway: collars, sugar, the Orpheum, toothbrushes, tobacco. Vote Charles E. Gehring. So he's very much impressed by this urban scenery of New York, where everything is equally important. Various things compete for the attention of the passerby. Whether it's advertising or political propaganda, it's all a part of the urban scenery. As I already mentioned before, it took Le Corbusier, the most important architecture writer and theorist of the 20th century, it took him another 22 years to actually get to America after he wrote his praise of American engineering structures. In 1935, he got an invitation from the Rockefeller Foundation to come on a tour of various places in America to give a few lectures in different universities and cultural organizations. Le Corbusier was important as a figure, but his practice was never a very good business. He built only around 40 buildings in his whole career. A lot of his proposals were left on paper, and he always struggled for new commissions. And he saw the opportunity of in his visit to New York and other European cities. He saw an opportunity to to make some business contacts, you know, to network. That was not this trip was not successful in this respect. He didn't get any commission in America, and he was much publicized by the press, but not treated seriously as an architect by the potential clients. But this journey was nonetheless very important for his development as an architecture thinker and as a writer, and it inspired him to write a book. It's called When the Cathedrals Were White. I'll explain the title in a moment. It was published in French in 1937. And in this book, he describes his journey to America and the various people he met, the various buildings and cities he saw, the factories, the colleges he visited. So it's a very interesting account of the travel, but also an urban manifesto. The second part of the book is his proposal for the redevelopment of New York, and I'll get there in a moment. It contains a famous quote: 100 times I have thought New York is a catastrophe, and 50 times it is a beautiful catastrophe. So you have the same sentiment that was already present in the writing of the other architecture tourists, of the admiration and the disenchantment. First, he was an attention seeker, so he addressed the American press with very snappy sentences like "I am an American." He really stressed the fact that he's impressed by the American civilization, by its scale and its boldness. At the same time, he would say New York is not a completed city. Of course it wasn't. It is a savage city. He admired the technological advances and the freshness of the American civilization, and hence the title, When the Cathedrals Were White. He basically argued that the moment that America was undergoing in the 30s was very similar to the moment that the European culture was in the Middle Ages, when people were able to build brilliant cathedrals, and they were driven by a very optimistic and a very innovative spirit, a spirit that he claimed Europe did not have anymore, but America did. So he likened the cathedrals of medieval Europe that were white, freshly built in the Middle Ages, to the freshly built skyscrapers of New York, that were in his eyes the embodiment of this optimism and the innovation of American culture. He also admired a lot of. He felt all this time, throughout his stay in America, he felt at the same time superior and inferior. He felt that he's coming from a place that's lagging behind America in many ways. For instance, in terms of the standard of living and accessibility of things like air conditioning, elevators, escalators, pre-packaged food. He loved it. Like he wrote a very enthusiastic sentence about being able to buy a pre-packaged sandwich at the train station. But at the same time, he stressed that it's a savage place, that it's a very unrefined place that is waiting for someone to give it a more sophisticated way, and he meant himself, of course. He also admired the grid of the streets in New York and other American cities. He claimed that the streets are at right angles to each other, and the mind is liberated. So he meant that in European cities that grew, well, most of the cities grew organically and in an organic way. People have to waste a lot of energy and waste a lot of time to think and to find their way around. Whereas in American cities, the streets form a grid, the streets are numbered, and one doesn't have to spend much time or effort to find your way. And that's one of the reasons why he thought that it's a great place to start a new to experiment with new ways of building cities. He also shocked the press by saying that American skyscrapers are much too low. By the time he got to America, the Empire State Building was already up, the tallest building in the world. So was the Rockefeller Center. So that the Americans were obviously very proud of this, but he would say that these skyscrapers are still too low. And that's why he thought that that America should use this ability to build a tall building to implement his ideas about the city. I already showed you this picture 2 weeks ago. This is Le Corbusier's earlier proposal for Paris. He proposed to, in the 1920s, to gradually erase the old urban fabric, the maze of old streets, and also the boulevards built in the 19th century, and replace it with an entirely new grid, a grid of streets like in New York, and a grid of roads, a grid of streets, and between these streets there would be greenery, and among this greenery there would be enormous towers, much taller in fact than the ones in New York, that would serve all sorts of purposes. Some of them would be used for office space, some of them for living. Thanks to an open plan, an open grid of columns inside the building, the space inside would be flexible, and it would be possible to arrange it both for housing and for office work. And he proposed to leave just a few old buildings lost between the new ones, like the most important monuments of the past, left between the new buildings, among the new buildings, like the souvenirs of the past. But otherwise, Paris was to become an entirely new city. It was not possible, of course, to realize that in Paris, but he thought that New York could be the place where it would be possible. It had the grid already. Unfortunately, it had the same problem that Paris had, the private ownership of land, that made it impossible to reshuffle the whole structure. But he believed that it would be possible to build. He advocated for it to be built in Manhattan, this new type of city, instead of the one that was already there. But he believed that it would be possible to build an entirely new city somewhere in America based on these principles, and that the American steel industry could be interested in that, because that would open up a huge market for them to build a new city entirely in steel structure. Also for the automobile industry, that would be happy to have a city that's planned for the automobile. But it was not to be. America was not interested. America was very much it was stuck in its old ways, and it was not interested. Another thing is that it took 10 years for this book to be published in English in America. So the French original was published in 1937, and the American edition was published in 1947, right after World War II, where the whole world was different and where America was in a different position. And it was actually America that lost its inferiority complex during World War II. It became the major superpower. And it started solving its problems with its own devices. But before I finish, I have to mention two very important, let's say, episodes from the European-American architecture relations in the early 20th century. A very important phenomenon that Maciej already mentioned in his talk 2 weeks ago, and I believe he will mention it in his next lectures, is the fact that a lot of European architects chose America as their place to live sometime before the Second World War or during the war, for political reasons, of course. And they formed a very strong community, emigre community within the American architecture community. One of them was José Louis Sert, who actually a disciple of Le Corbusier's, and it's very interesting that America was not interested in Le Corbusier's ideas, but it very quickly absorbed the ideas of his disciples. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that they actually chose to live there, and they developed their own networks in universities and business communities, etc., and in the government. Whereas Le Corbusier was just a door-to-door salesman who came to New York to sell his ideas, like he had already done in many other places. So José Louis Sert published a very important book in 1942, Can Our Cities Survive? It's basically a manual, a handbook of building better cities, based on Le Corbusier's ideas, but with Sert's name on the cover, and also adapted to the American reality, and also to the challenges that the architecture community was already anticipating for the post-war period. And José Louis Sert was also responsible by another important manifesto that helped shape that helped give ideological background for American architecture after World War II. He wrote it together with Fernand Léger, the famous French artist, and Siegfried Giedion, a Swiss theorist, architecture theorist, a close collaborator of Le Corbusier, who also found himself in America in the 40s, but then went back to Europe. It's called 9 Points of Monumentality, and I see it as the final, let's say the final, the final attempt of European tourists, of European architecture tourists, to give America, let's say, a more American architecture a more mature form, because what Le Corbusier and many other people before World War II said was that American architecture is great in a way. In a way, it explores new technical possibilities, but at the same time, it's immature. It's timid, they said. Le Corbusier called America the land of the timid. So these three men wrote a manifesto that was aimed at giving American architects more bold direction, and at the same time to insert some of the most important ideals of modern architecture and planning, integrate them into American architecture practice. So these are 9 points, and I will cover them very briefly. The first is that architecture needs to be built in a way to outlive the period which originated it. So this is the understanding of monumentalism, that architecture is not meant to be disposable, as it was in America back then. Buildings going up and being, some of the early skyscrapers were gone by the time they reached 20. So buildings should be built with to constitute a heritage for future generations. Secondly, they should be the expression of man's highest cultural needs. So again, a call to be more sophisticated and more sophisticated, and also to try to express not just the individual need of the client or the particular the end user, but also the feeling and the thinking of the collective force, the people, so a larger community, not just the people who are responsible for the particular building. Thirdly, the monuments are only possible in periods in which a unifying consciousness and unifying culture exists, and they found that this sort of unifying culture already exists in America, that it's no longer a bad copy of Europe that could be considered a few decades earlier, but full-fledged culture, full-fledged civilization. 4. The last 100 years have witnessed the devaluation of monumentality. The so-called monuments of recent date have, with rare exceptions, become empty shells. They in no way represent the spirit of the collective feeling of modern times. So again, you can picture the skyscrapers covered with that strive to have a monumental form, but they were somehow hollow. I'll skip to number 5. They called to integrate architecture and urban planning. This is a problem that did not exist in was nearly non-existent in America before then. There were some attempts to bring these two fields together, the architecture and the planning. But generally, the cities developed on this very neutral grids that were ready for any type of building. 6. A new step lies ahead. Post-war changes in the whole economic structure of nations may bring with them the organization of community life in the city, which has been practically neglected up to date. That actually means that they saw an opportunity to reorganize the society, the American society after the war, and to make the collective aspect stronger. For instance, to give the municipalities possibility to organize the city and not just regulate the organic growth of the city. 7. The people want the buildings that represent their social and community life to give more than functional fulfillment. They want their aspiration for monumentality, joy, pride, and excitement to be satisfied. So again, a call for a more civic architecture, and also for the integration of the work of the planner, architect, painter, sculptor, and landscape designer. 8. Sites for monuments must be planned. That's also a response to a thing that a lot of European planners and architects despised about American cities. That even the most prominent buildings don't have proper sites. They are just randomly organized on the grid of streets without public squares, without carefully composed vistas, etc. And 9. Modern materials and new techniques are at hand. Light metal structures, curved laminated wooden arches, panels of different textures, colors and sizes, light elements like ceilings which can be suspended from big trusses, covering practically unlimited spans. Mobile elements, and then during night hours, color and forms can be projected on vast surfaces, so again neon, advertising, etc. Basically they were calling American architects to use all the modern technical advances as the main part of the language of architecture, not just something you use for practical reasons and then conceal behind the facade, but something that you actually expose and that you actually treat as the main stuff of architecture. Monumental architecture will be something more than strictly functional. It will have regained its lyrical value. In such monumental layouts, architecture and city planning could attain a new freedom and develop new creative possibilities, such as those that have begun to be felt in the last decades in the fields of painting, sculpture, music and poetry. So they were basically hoping for architecture to be right next to these fields of art, not just a practical tool to solve functional problems or to solve business or to serve the business, but as an art. And that's 1943, right before the end of World War II. I believe that Maciej will cover the post-war decades in more detail in his next talks. So you will see how these statements translated into architecture, into actually built architecture in the post-war decades. Thank you.